The emergency room doors at Ridgeway General Hospital burst open with a violent crash that echoed through the sterile corridors like thunder. Rain poured from the midnight storm outside, but what stepped through those automatic doors wasn't human. It was a German shepherd, massive and soaking wet, his police K9 vest hanging in tatters, blood streaking his matted fur. In his powerful jaws, he carried something that made every nurse, every doctor, every person in that lobby freeze in absolute horror. A child, a little girl, no more than 6 years old, unconscious and bleeding, her bare feet dangling lifeless as the dog gently placed her on the nearest gurney. The silence that followed was deafening. Coffee cups crashed to the floor. Pens dropped from trembling hands. Security guards reached for their radios but couldn't find words. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Dogs don't rescue children. Dogs don't navigate city streets in storms. Dogs don't burst into hospitals, demanding help. But this one did. His eyes, amber and fierce, locked onto the medical staff with an intelligence that sent chills down their spines. Then he barked once, sharp and commanding, a sound that seemed to say everything and nothing at the same time. Get help, now. She's dying, save her. The medical team snapped into action, wheeling the girl toward Trauma Bay 3, but the dog didn't leave. He followed, step by step, growling low whenever anyone tried to separate him from his precious cargo. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, had seen everything in 15 years of emergency medicine, but nothing like this. The girl's injuries told a story that made her stomach turn. Old needle marks, rope burns around her ankles, trauma that spoke of months, maybe years of captivity. Who was she? Where had she come from? And how had a dog found her when every authority, every search team, every missing persons unit had failed? 3 hours later, as Emily whispered her first word since arriving safe, Detective Mike Grant arrived at the hospital with news that would change everything. He stared at the German shepherd sitting guard outside the trauma bay and felt his blood run cold. That vest, those markings, the faded police badge hanging from a torn collar. He knew this dog. Everyone in law enforcement knew this dog. This was Rocky, K9 Unit 412, officially declared dead 6 months ago after a house fire that killed his handler, Officer Tom Daniels. The fire that investigators said left no survivors, no trace, no hope. Yet here he was, alive, battle-scarred, and carrying secrets that could shatter everything they thought they knew about that night. Grant pulled out his phone and scrolled through old case files until he found it. The Redmore Pines incident, a supposed meth lab explosion that consumed an entire farmhouse and everyone inside. The report stated clearly, Officer Daniels died attempting a rescue. His K9 partner Rocky was presumed dead. Body never recovered. Case closed. But if Rocky was alive, if he'd been surviving on his own for 6 months, where had he been? And more importantly, where had he found Emily? The girl's medical examination revealed horrors that no child should endure, but one detail stood out above the rest. Her blood work showed traces of experimental drugs, compounds that weren't available on any street, substances that could only come from one place: a laboratory, a hidden facility designed for testing on children. As Grant stared at Rocky through the observation window, watching the dog's unwavering vigil over Emily's unconscious form, a terrifying realization began to take shape. This wasn't a rescue. This was an escape. And somewhere in the darkness, in places that didn't exist on any map, there might be others, other children, other victims, other secrets that a dead dog and a nameless girl had risked everything to expose. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching us from? In the shadowy world of law enforcement, K9 units represent the ultimate partnership between human and animal, a bond forged in training, tested in combat, and sealed with unwavering loyalty that transcends life itself. These specially trained dogs don't just follow orders. They become extensions of their handlers' souls, capable of detecting what human senses cannot perceive and navigating dangers that would paralyze even the bravest officers. But what happens when that sacred bond is severed by tragedy? What happens when a canine officer loses everything, yet something deep within their trained instincts refuses to surrender? Tonight's story takes us into the heart of Georgia, where a single German shepherd named Rocky would prove that heroism doesn't die with duty, and that sometimes the most impossible rescues come from the most unexpected saviors. 6 months before that storm-soaked night at Ridgeway General Hospital, Rocky was living the life every police dog dreams of. His handler, Officer Tom Daniels, was a 20-year veteran of the force, a man whose reputation for finding missing persons was legendary throughout the state. Together, they had saved countless lives, tracked down dangerous criminals, and built a legacy that would inspire an entire generation of canine units. Their final mission was supposed to be routine, a tip about suspicious activity at an abandoned farmhouse in Redmore Pines, a property that had been empty for years, according to county records. But county records lie, and sometimes the most innocent-looking places hide the darkest secrets. The fire that consumed the farmhouse that night was no accident, and the explosion that officials blamed on a meth lab was actually something far more sinister. It was the destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the systematic erasure of crimes that went deeper than anyone imagined. Officer Daniels died in those flames, but Rocky didn't just survive. He escaped with knowledge that would eventually lead him back to the source of evil that had claimed his partner's life. For 6 months, he wandered the wilderness of Georgia, following scents that spoke of fear and desperation, tracking trails that led to places where children's screams echoed in underground chambers, places where science had twisted into something monstrous. Rocky wasn't just a lost dog during those months of solitude. He was a soldier without a unit, a guardian without a post, carrying the weight of memories that human minds couldn't comprehend. He remembered the smell of terror, the sound of small voices calling for help, and the face of evil wearing a doctor's coat. Every night he dreamed of his fallen partner's final command: find them, save them, bring them home. But some missions take longer than expected, and some rescues require sacrifices that only the purest hearts can make. What Rocky discovered in the depths of Georgia's forgotten places would eventually lead him through a storm into a hospital, carrying a broken child who held the key to exposing a nightmare that authorities never knew existed. The storm that night was biblical in its fury, turning the streets of downtown Atlanta into rivers of rushing water and debris. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, illuminating a world gone mad with wind and rain. Most sensible creatures had taken shelter hours ago, but on the empty highway leading to Ridgeway General Hospital, a lone figure moved with desperate determination through the chaos. Rocky's massive frame cut through the storm like a ship navigating treacherous seas, his police vest hanging in shreds, his fur matted with blood both old and fresh. But it wasn't his own blood that stained his coat, it was hers. Emily's small body hung limp in his powerful jaws, her unconscious form protected by an instinct older than training, deeper than duty. He had carried her for miles through wilderness and urban sprawl, following some internal compass that guided him toward the one place that might save her life. The automatic doors of the emergency room sensed his approach and slid open with a mechanical whisper that was instantly drowned by the storm's roar. The contrast was jarring, stepping from nature's violence into the sterile calm of modern medicine. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white reality. The smell of disinfectant and fear filled his nostrils, but Rocky pressed forward because stopping wasn't an option. Nurse Carla Martinez was the first to see him, and the coffee cup in her hands exploded against the floor in a shower of ceramic and steaming liquid. Her scream pierced the night shift's routine like a siren, bringing every available staff member running toward the lobby. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from Trauma Bay 3, her surgical scrubs still pristine, her mind shifting from the mundane to the impossible in the span of a heartbeat. The German shepherd stood in the center of the room, water pooling at his feet, his amber eyes reflecting an intelligence that made seasoned medical professionals take involuntary steps backward. But it was what he carried that stopped their hearts entirely. Emily's pale face was visible above his gentle grip, her dark hair plastered to her skull, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. Rope, burns circled her thin wrists like grotesque jewelry, and needle marks dotted her arms with the precision of clinical experimentation. Rocky approached the nearest gurney with the careful deliberation of a pallbearer, each step measured and respectful. He placed Emily down with the tenderness of a father tucking his child into bed, then stepped back and released a bark that echoed through the hospital corridors like a battle cry. It wasn't the random noise of an animal. It was communication, urgent and desperate, a plea that transcended species barriers. Help her, it seemed to say. Save her, she's suffered enough. The medical team sprang into action with the choreographed precision of emergency room veterans, but Rocky didn't retreat. He followed the gurney step by step, his protective instincts overriding every attempt to separate him from his precious cargo. Security guards reached for their radios, maintenance workers grabbed mops to clean the spreading puddle, and somewhere in the chaos, someone whispered the question that would haunt them all. Where the hell did this dog come from? Detective Mike Grant had seen enough crime scenes to know when something felt wrong, and the phone call that dragged him from his warm bed at 3 in the morning carried that unmistakable tone of disbelief that only came with the truly inexplicable. A dog bringing a wounded child to the hospital wasn't just unusual. It was the kind of story that made hardened cops question their sanity. But as Grant stood in the sterile hallway of Ridgeway General, staring through the observation window at the German shepherd who refused to leave Emily's side, his professional skepticism crumbled into something far more disturbing. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak. The faded police insignia on the torn vest, the distinctive markings around the dog's left ear, the way he held his head with that particular alertness that came from years of specialized training. This wasn't just any K9 unit. This was Rocky, badge number 412, officially declared killed in action 6 months ago, along with his handler, Officer Tom Daniels. Grant's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the case files, double-checking details he knew by heart. The Redmore Pines incident had been classified as a tragedy, but not a mystery. Officer Daniels had responded to reports of suspicious activity at an abandoned farmhouse, and the resulting explosion had consumed everything within a 100-yard radius. The official report stated that both officer and dog had perished in what investigators determined was a meth lab accident. Their bodies were never recovered, but the intensity of the fire had left precious little evidence of anything. Case closed, heroes honored, life moved on. But heroes don't rise from the dead, and police dogs don't survive months in the wilderness, only to emerge carrying victims of crimes that shouldn't exist. Grant's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If Rocky had survived the explosion, where had he been for 6 months? If the farmhouse fire wasn't what it seemed, what had really happened that night? And most importantly, where had he found Emily? The girl's medical examination was painting a picture that made veteran detectives physically ill. The rope burns, the needle marks, the signs of prolonged captivity and systematic abuse suggested something far beyond random kidnapping. This was organized, methodical, scientific in its precision. Dr. Chen emerged from the trauma bay with the haunted expression of someone who had seen too much, her surgical mask hanging loose around her neck like a defeated flag. The injuries were consistent with long-term imprisonment, she reported, but there were other factors that defied explanation. Emily's blood work showed traces of compounds that weren't available on any street, experimental drugs that suggested in pharmaceutical-grade equipment and knowledge. Someone with serious resources and scientific training had been using this child as a test subject, and somehow a supposedly dead police dog had found her and orchestrated her escape. As Grant watched Rocky maintain his vigil beside Emily's unconscious form, the dog's amber eyes met his through the glass with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Those weren't the eyes of a lost animal seeking shelter from a storm. Those were the eyes of a soldier who had completed one mission and was preparing for the next. Rocky had brought Emily to safety, but his work wasn't finished. Somewhere in the darkness of Georgia's hidden places, there were others waiting for rescue, others who needed a guardian angel with 4 legs and the heart of a warrior. Emily's awakening came in fragments, consciousness returning like pieces of a shattered mirror, slowly reassembling into something recognizable. Her eyelids fluttered open to reveal pupils, dilated with trauma and confusion, scanning the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room as if expecting it to transform into something more familiar and terrifying. Dr. Chen sat beside her bed with the patience of someone who understood that healing required more than medicine. Her voice gentle as morning rain when she spoke. The first word Emily whispered was so soft that only the most sensitive ears could catch it, but Rocky heard everything. Safe. The single syllable carried the weight of months of terror, the desperate hope of a child who had learned not to trust in rescue, who had seen promises broken and prayers unanswered until a German shepherd with amber eyes had proven that miracles still existed in the darkest corners of the world. Rocky lifted his massive head from where he had been resting beside her bed, his tail offering the slightest wag of acknowledgement, as if to say, "Yes, you are safe now. I promise you are safe." The bond between them was immediately obvious to everyone in the room, something deeper than circumstance, stronger than gratitude. This wasn't just a dog who had found a lost child. This was a partnership forged in the crucible of shared trauma. 2 survivors who had pulled each other through hell and emerged on the other side forever changed. When Emily's small hand reached out and buried itself in Rocky's thick fur, the tears that followed weren't just relief. They were recognition. She knew this dog, trusted him in a way that suggested their connection hadn't begun at the moment of rescue, but had been building through long nights of captivity when hope was the only thing keeping her alive. Dr. Lillian Tate, the hospital's child psychologist, observed these early interactions with professional fascination and personal heartbreak. Emily's responses to standard questions revealed a mind that had been systematically conditioned to fear authority figures, to expect pain from those who claim to help, to measure safety not in words, but in the presence of a 4-legged guardian who had never lied to her. When asked about her captors, Emily's description sent chills through everyone present. "They had badges," she whispered. "Not police badges, but something that looked official, something that gave them authority in her young mind. They wore white coats and spoke in clinical terms about subjects and procedures, treating her not as a human being, but as raw material for experiments that defied every medical ethic known to civilization." The most disturbing revelation came when Emily mentioned other children, friends who had shared her nightmare until they were taken away to places she never saw again. Rocky seemed to understand every word of her testimony, his ears perking up at certain names, his body tensing when she described the rooms where they had been kept. It became clear that his knowledge of their captivity was intimate and personal, that he had witnessed horrors that would have broken the spirit of any creature less determined to see justice done. When Detective Grant arrived to conduct a gentle interview, Emily's first question wasn't about her safety or her future. It was about Rocky's well-being. "Will they take him away from me?" she asked, with the desperation of someone who had lost everything once before and couldn't bear to lose the only constant in her traumatic world. Grant's promise that Rocky would stay by her side seemed to unlock something in Emily's damaged psyche, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, she smiled, Following Rocky's lead had become second nature to the investigative team, but nothing could have prepared them for what they discovered in the drainage tunnel 2 miles from the hospital. The blood trail was faint but persistent, leading through dense Georgia pine forests and overgrown hiking paths that hadn't seen human traffic in years. Rocky moved with the confidence of someone retracing familiar steps, his nose occasionally lifting to catch scents that spoke of recent activity and old terror. When they reached the tunnel entrance, hidden beneath a carefully constructed covering of branches and debris, the smell that emerged made seasoned detectives gag with revulsion. It wasn't just the stench of human waste and decay, it was the clinical odor of disinfectant mixed with something far more sinister, the unmistakable aroma of fear that had soaked into concrete walls over months of systematic abuse. The tunnel stretched deeper than anyone expected, sloping downward into a network of chambers that had been carved from the earth with professional precision. This wasn't the crude hideout of random criminals. It was an engineered facility designed for long-term occupation and horrific purpose. Emergency lighting still functioned along the walls, powered by a generator that hummed with mechanical indifference to the atrocities it had illuminated. The first cell they discovered contained evidence that made hardened investigators physically sick. Child-sized restraints bolted to the walls, medical equipment arranged with clinical precision, and charts documenting procedures that violated every principle of human dignity. But it was the drawings scratched into the concrete that told the real story. Primitive artwork created by small fingers, desperate to leave some record of their existence. Stick figures with numbers instead of names, crude depictions of men in white coats holding syringes, and in one corner, a carefully rendered image of a German shepherd with the word "hero" written beneath in a child's uncertain handwriting. Rocky stood in the center of this chamber of horrors with the composure of a soldier surveying a battlefield, but his amber eyes held memories that no living creature should carry. Detective Grant realized that Rocky hadn't just discovered this place during his months of wandering. He had been here before, possibly multiple times, learning the layout and planning an escape that would eventually save Emily's life. The evidence suggested that children had been held here for extended periods, subjected to medical experiments that had no legitimate purpose beyond satisfying some twisted curiosity about human tolerance for pain and psychological manipulation. Blood samples found in primitive laboratory equipment indicated pharmaceutical testing on an industrial scale, using innocent victims as laboratory rats in research that belonged in the darkest chapters of history rather than the modern world. When forensic teams began processing the scene, they discovered something that changed everything. Fresh tire tracks in the mud outside the tunnel entrance, too recent to have been there during Emily's imprisonment, suggesting that whoever had operated this facility was still active, still dangerous, and very likely preparing to eliminate any evidence that might lead authorities to their current location. Rocky's behavior became increasingly agitated as the investigation progressed, his protective instincts extending beyond Emily to encompass a broader mission that seemed to drive him with supernatural determination. He wasn't just a rescue dog who had found one victim. He was a guardian angel who understood that his work was far from finished, and that somewhere in the darkness, other children were waiting for salvation that might never come without his intervention. Officer Tom Daniels had been Rocky's partner for 7 years when they received the call that would change everything, a routine investigation that would expose horrors beyond imagination and cost both men their lives in different ways. The official reports painted a simple picture of heroic sacrifice, but the truth was far more complex and infinitely more disturbing. Daniels had been tracking a series of missing children cases that seemed unrelated on the surface, but shared disturbing commonalities when examined through the lens of a detective's intuition. All the victims were between 5 and 8 years old. All had been taken from situations where their disappearance might be attributed to family dysfunction or runaways. and all had vanished without leaving the kind of evidence that usually accompanies kidnapping cases. What bothered Daniels most was the complete absence of witness testimony or physical evidence, as if these children had simply ceased to exist the moment they left their homes. Rocky's specialized training in search and rescue had been invaluable in cold cases where traditional investigation methods had failed, but this particular pattern of disappearances presented challenges that tested even his exceptional abilities. The scent trails always led to dead ends, usually near medical facilities or research institutions that had legitimate reasons for chemical odors that might mask human tracks. It wasn't until they received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at the Redmore Pines farmhouse that the pieces began falling into place in ways that no one could have anticipated. The farmhouse itself was unremarkable from the outside, a decaying structure that had been abandoned for decades according to county records, but Rocky's behavior suggested something far more sinister hidden beneath its innocent facade. His agitation began long before they reached the property, his trained instincts detecting scents and sounds that spoke of human distress emanating from underground chambers that shouldn't have existed. When Daniels called for backup before entering the building, he had no way of knowing that their radio communications were being monitored by people who had spent years perfecting the art of making problems disappear. The explosion that consumed the farmhouse was triggered the moment they breached the main entrance, a carefully planned elimination of witnesses that was meant to bury evidence and ensure that the truth died with those who discovered it. Daniels sacrificed his life trying to reach the children imprisoned in the underground facility, but Rocky's survival was no accident. His handler's final command had been clear and desperate: find them, save them. Don't let them die for nothing. The German Shepherd had escaped the inferno through a ventilation system that led to the drainage tunnel, carrying with him memories of horrors that would drive him through 6 months of solitary investigation and eventual rescue of the one child he could save. During those months of presumed death, Rocky had become something unprecedented in law enforcement history. A K-9 unit operating without human oversight, following leads and gathering intelligence that human investigators had missed despite years of professional training. His intimate knowledge of the tunnel system had been earned through countless reconnaissance missions, learning guard schedules and security protocols, waiting for the perfect moment to attempt a rescue that would require every ounce of his training and courage. When that moment finally came, Rocky didn't hesitate to trade his life for Emily's, carrying her through a storm that should have killed them both, driven by loyalty to a fallen partner and love for an innocent child who had suffered enough. The man in dark clothing who appeared on the hospital security cameras at 2:47 a.m. moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there. But his presence triggered alarms in Rocky's consciousness that had nothing to do with security systems or human intuition. The German Shepherd's reaction was immediate and visceral, rising from sleep beside Emily's bed, like a warrior answering a battle cry that only he could hear. His low growl carried a warning that resonated through the hospital corridors, awakening instincts in nursing staff who had learned to trust the wisdom of a dog who had already proven his ability to detect dangers invisible to human senses. Emily stirred at the sound, her small hand reaching automatically for Rocky's reassuring presence, but her whispered words carried terror that spoke of experiences no child should remember. "Don't let them take me again," she pleaded, her voice breaking with the desperate vulnerability of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary and rescue often led to recapture by monsters wearing familiar faces. Rocky's protective stance left no doubt about his intentions, but his knowledge of the intruder suggested something more personal than random hospital security, a recognition that spoke of previous encounters in darker places where children screamed and adults pretended not to hear. Officer Barnes arrived at the hospital within minutes of the security alert, her weapon drawn and her mind prepared for confrontation. but nothing in her law enforcement training had prepared her for the sight of Rocky hunting through the hospital's basement corridors with the methodical precision of a predator who knew exactly what he was seeking. The maintenance tunnels beneath Ridgeway General were a labyrinth of pipes and electrical conduits that most staff members never saw, but Rocky navigated them with the confidence of someone following a familiar scent trail that led directly to danger. When Barnes caught up with him, she found the intruder cornered in a storage room, his surgical gloves stained with blood and his syringe loaded with something that forensic analysis would later identify as a fast-acting paralytic compound designed to incapacitate victims without killing them. Immediately, the man's reaction to seeing Rocky was immediate and unmistakable terror, the response of someone confronting a nightmare that should have been dead and buried, along with all the evidence of crimes that spanned multiple states. His attempt to use the syringe as a weapon was futile against a German shepherd who had been trained to neutralize armed suspects, but Rocky's restraint in subduing rather than killing the intruder spoke to a discipline that transcended animal instincts and entered the realm of conscious choice. The arrest revealed details that connected this midnight assault to the larger conspiracy that had been operating in Georgia's shadows for years. But the most disturbing discovery came when forensic teams analyzed the intruder's fingerprints and found matches to crime scenes across 3 states where children had disappeared under circumstances identical to Emily's original kidnapping. This wasn't a random attempt to eliminate a witness. It was part of a systematic cleanup operation designed to erase evidence and silence voices that might expose the full scope of horrors that had been hidden beneath the facade of legitimate medical research. Rocky's intervention had saved more than Emily's life. It had preserved the only testimony that could lead authorities to other victims who might still be alive and waiting for rescue in facilities that existed beyond the reach of traditional law enforcement methods. The encrypted phone recovered from the hospital intruder contained digital breadcrumbs that led Detective Grant into a world of shadow organizations and scientific experiments that existed in the darkest corners of legitimate research. Each decoded message revealed layers of conspiracy that stretched far beyond Georgia's borders, connecting missing children cases across multiple states to a network of facilities that operated under the protection of falsified government contracts and academic credentials that had been purchased rather than earned. The name Dr. Malcolm Park appeared repeatedly in the communications, always referenced with the kind of reverence reserved for someone whose authority was absolute and whose methods were beyond question. Background research revealed a brilliant neurobehavioral specialist who had been quietly expelled from every major university and research institution in the country, not for lack of ability, but for ethical violations that made even hardened academics uncomfortable with his presence. Park's obsession with childhood development and psychological conditioning had led him down paths that legitimate science refused to follow. But private funding from sources that valued results over ethics had allowed him to continue his work in facilities that existed outside the scrutiny of oversight committees and medical boards. The forensic analysis of Emily's blood work provided disturbing confirmation of experimental procedures that had no medical justification beyond satisfying scientific curiosity about human tolerance for psychological manipulation and pharmaceutical intervention. The compounds found in her system were prototypes that hadn't been approved for testing on animals, much less children, suggesting research that violated every international treaty governing human experimentation. When federal authorities finally obtained warrants to search properties connected to Park's shell companies, they discovered a network of abandoned medical facilities that had been systematically stripped of evidence, but still contained traces of activities that painted a picture of organized child trafficking disguised as scientific research. The most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that the Redmore Pines farmhouse hadn't been an isolated facility, but part of a larger operation that had been relocating and expanding for years, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement by eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence before moving to new locations. Rocky's survival and Emily's rescue had disrupted a carefully orchestrated system that had been operating with impunity for decades. But the scope of the conspiracy suggested that shutting down one facility would only force the others to become more careful, rather than cease operations entirely. The breakthrough came when cryptographers decoded a series of messages that referenced a new facility called the Galloway Compound, described as an upgraded research environment that would allow for expanded studies and improved security measures. Location data embedded in the messages led authorities to a stretch of private land 20 miles north of Atlanta, officially registered as a corporate retreat, but equipped with security measures that suggested something far more sinister than executive conferences and team-building exercises. As the multi-agency task force prepared for what would become the largest child rescue operation in Georgia's history, Rocky seemed to sense that his mission was approaching its climax. His behavior became increasingly focused and determined, as if he understood that the next phase of his work would require every ounce of training and courage he possessed. The German shepherd, who had been presumed dead for 6 months, was about to prove that heroism doesn't end with duty, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those who refuse to accept that evil can triumph, simply because it hides in places where good people fear to. Look, dawn was breaking over the Georgia pine forests when the convoy of federal agents, local law enforcement, and specialized rescue teams surrounded the Galloway compound. But it was Rocky who led them through the outer perimeter with the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for months. The facility appeared innocuous from a distance, designed to blend seamlessly with the corporate retreat centers that dotted the Georgia countryside. But the German shepherd's agitation as they approached confirmed what satellite surveillance had only hinted at. This was no peaceful conference center. It was a fortress designed to keep secrets buried and witnesses silenced forever. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when thermal imaging revealed basement levels that extended far deeper than any legitimate building would require, with heat signatures that suggested large numbers of people confined in underground chambers that shouldn't have existed according to the building's public blueprints. Rocky's nose led the tactical team directly to a service entrance that had been camouflaged with professional precision, but his intimate knowledge of similar facilities allowed him to navigate security measures that would have delayed human investigators for precious hours while evidence was destroyed and victims were moved to even more remote locations. The sounds that emerged from the underground levels as they breached the facility's defenses were the stuff of nightmares, children's voices raised in terror and confusion as alarms triggered emergency protocols that had been designed to eliminate evidence rather than preserve life. Rocky moved through the corridors with purpose that transcended animal instincts, his training and experience combining with supernatural determination to locate victims who had been hidden in chambers that investigators might have missed despite their best efforts. The first child they found was a boy named Charlie, more than 7 years old, who recognized Rocky immediately and reached through the bars of his cell with desperate relief that spoke of previous rescue attempts that had ended in recapture and punishment. The reunion between Rocky and the children he had been unable to save during his first infiltration was heartbreaking and triumphant simultaneously, proof that his months of solitary investigation had been driven by more than duty or training, but by love for innocent victims who had suffered. Beyond imagination, as rescue teams worked to evacuate the underground facility, the full scope of Dr. Park's operation became horrifyingly clear. Medical equipment worth millions of dollars had been used to conduct experiments that belonged in the darkest chapters of human history, treating children as laboratory subjects in research that had no legitimate scientific purpose, beyond satisfying the twisted curiosity of minds that had abandoned every principle of medical ethics. The documentation, recovered from Park's computers, revealed a network of similar facilities operating across the country, connected by encrypted communications and funded by sources that included legitimate pharmaceutical companies who had been unknowingly financing research that violated every law governing human experimentation. When they finally located Dr. Park himself, barricaded in his private laboratory with enough chemical weapons to kill everyone in the facility, it was Rocky who prevented the final catastrophe by detecting the explosive devices that had been designed to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses before authorities could gather the testimony needed to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. The German Shepherd's intervention saved not only the children who were still alive, but preserved the evidence that would eventually lead to the dismantling of an international network of facilities where innocence had been sacrificed on the altar of scientific ambition, unconstrained by conscience or compassion. The moment Emily saw the other children being brought up from the underground chambers, her reaction confirmed what everyone had suspected but hoped wasn't true. These weren't strangers who had shared similar trauma. They were friends who had endured months of captivity together, forming bonds that transcended family relationships and created a surrogate kinship born from shared suffering and mutual protection. Mia and Evan ran to Emily with tears streaming down their faces, their reunion taking place in the shadow of Rocky, who stood guard over all of them, with the satisfaction of a mission finally completed after months of patient planning and desperate determination. The children's accounts of their imprisonment revealed systematic psychological conditioning that had been designed to break their spirits and eliminate any hope of rescue. But Rocky's presence during their darkest moments had provided the anchor of hope that kept them sane when everything else suggested that the world had forgotten they existed. Dr. Park's capture provided the final pieces of a puzzle that stretched back decades and involved victims who had been presumed dead or lost forever, in a system that treated human beings as raw material for experiments that served no purpose beyond advancing the career of a man whose brilliant mind had been corrupted by absolute power over helpless victims. The pharmaceutical companies that had unknowingly funded Park's research through legitimate grants quickly distanced themselves from any connection to his work. But the damage had been done, and the children who survived would carry physical and emotional scars that no amount of money or publicity could heal. Rocky's role in exposing the conspiracy elevated him from local hero to national symbol, but the German Shepherd seemed more interested in the welfare of the children he had saved than the media attention that followed their rescue. When Emily was finally released from the hospital and placed in protective custody with Officer Barnes, Rocky's transition from rescue dog to family pet was seamless and natural, as if he had always been meant to spend his retirement years protecting one small girl who had suffered more than any child should endure. The legal proceedings that followed Park's arrest revealed the international scope of his operation, with similar facilities discovered in countries where oversight was minimal and cooperation with American authorities was limited by political considerations that valued economic relationships over human rights concerns. The children who were rescued from the Galloway compound became the key witnesses in trials that would eventually send dozens of conspirators to prison for life. But their testimony was given behind closed doors to protect their identities and shield them from public scrutiny that might re-traumatize young minds that were still healing from months of systematic abuse. Rocky's presence during these legal proceedings provided comfort and security that allowed the children to speak truthfully about horrors that most adults could barely comprehend. his calming influence making it possible for prosecutors to gather the evidence needed to ensure that justice was served and that similar operations would face the full weight of international law enforcement cooperation. The transformation of Rocky from police dog to therapy animal happened naturally and without formal recognition, but his ability to provide emotional support to traumatized children became legendary among the social workers and psychologists who worked with survivors of similar crimes across the country. Dr. Malcolm Park's trial became a media sensation that exposed the darkest corners of unregulated scientific research. But for Emily and the other survivors, the proceedings represented something far more personal than justice served on a national stage. Their testimony, given through closed-circuit television to protect their identities, painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as medical research that made even seasoned prosecutors struggle to maintain their professional composure while presenting evidence to a jury that seemed physically ill from the revelations. Park himself showed no remorse during the proceedings, maintaining the clinical detachment that had allowed him to treat children as laboratory specimens for years without apparent conscience or recognition of their humanity. His defense team's attempt to portray him as a brilliant scientist whose methods were unconventional but potentially beneficial to medical advancement crumbled under the weight of evidence that showed no legitimate scientific purpose beyond satisfying his obsession with psychological manipulation and pharmaceutical experimentation on helpless victims. Rocky attended every session where the children testified, his presence providing the emotional anchor that allowed them to relive their trauma in service of ensuring that their tormentor would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims. The German Shepherd's behavior during the trial was remarkable for its restraint and dignity, showing no aggression toward Park, despite recognizing him as the architect of horrors that had claimed his partner's life and traumatized children who had become his surrogate pack. The evidence presented during the trial revealed an international network of similar facilities operating under the protection of legitimate research institutions and government contracts that had been obtained through falsified credentials and bribery that reached into the highest levels of academic and political establishments. Pharmaceutical companies that had unknowingly funded Park's research through legitimate grants faced congressional investigations that exposed systemic failures in oversight mechanisms designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse that had flourished under their indirect sponsorship. The testimony of other victims who were located in facilities across multiple countries provided additional evidence that Park's operation was part of a larger conspiracy that treated human trafficking as a supply chain for scientific research that violated every international treaty governing medical experimentation and children's rights. When the verdict was finally announced, Park's conviction on multiple counts of human trafficking, child abuse, and medical malpractice carried a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. But the children who had survived his experiments understood that true justice would require healing that might take decades to achieve. The establishment of a victims' fund using assets seized from Park's operation provided financial support for the survivors' medical and psychological treatment, but no amount of money could restore the innocence that had been stolen or erase the memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Rocky's role in the legal proceedings was formally recognized when he was awarded a special commendation from the Department of Justice for his service in exposing crimes that had eluded traditional law enforcement for years. But the German Shepherd seemed more interested in the welfare of the children than the ceremonies that celebrated his heroism. The international cooperation that resulted from the investigation led to the discovery and closure of similar facilities in countries where oversight was minimal and cooperation with American authorities had previously been limited by diplomatic considerations that valued economic relationships over human rights concerns. 6 months after the trial concluded, the ripple effects of Rocky's heroic actions continued to transform lives and institutions across the country, creating changes that would protect future generations of children from the kind of systematic abuse that had flourished in the shadows of legitimate medical research. Emily's integration into her new life with Officer Barnes progressed with remarkable resilience, but the scars of her imprisonment would require years of therapy and the constant presence of a German shepherd who had become more than a pet, evolving into a living symbol of hope and protection that made normal childhood experiences possible despite traumatic memories. The other survivors from the Galloway compound were placed in carefully selected foster homes where their special needs could be addressed, by families who understood that healing from such profound trauma required patience, understanding, and the kind of love that expected nothing in return except the opportunity to help innocent victims reclaim their stolen childhoods. Congressional hearings triggered by the investigation resulted in comprehensive reforms to oversight mechanisms governing medical research involving human subjects, with particular attention to protecting children from exploitation by researchers whose scientific credentials masked predatory intentions that violated every principle of medical ethics. The International Task Force, established to investigate similar operations, discovered facilities in 12 countries where children had been subjected to experiments that ranged from pharmaceutical testing to psychological conditioning programs that treated young minds as raw material for research that served no legitimate scientific purpose. Rocky's transformation from police dog to therapy animal became a model for programs that recognized the unique ability of specially trained dogs to provide emotional support to traumatized children who had learned to distrust human authority figures, but could still respond to the unconditional love and protection offered by animals who asked nothing except the chance to serve. The documentary that chronicled Rocky's story became required viewing in law enforcement academies across the country, illustrating how traditional investigation methods could be enhanced by recognizing the unique capabilities of canine units whose training and instincts allowed them to detect evidence that human investigators might miss despite their best efforts and most sophisticated technology. The scholarship fund established in Officer Tom Daniels' memory provided financial support for children who had survived trafficking situations, ensuring that their education would not be compromised by the trauma they had endured or the circumstances that had made them vulnerable to predators who exploited society's most defenseless members. Dr. Lillian Tate's research on recovery patterns among the survivors contributed to treatment protocols that recognized the importance of maintaining connections to the sources of strength that had sustained victims during their darkest moments, whether those sources were human relationships, animal companions, or spiritual beliefs that transcended immediate circumstances. The reform of child protective services in multiple states included provisions for recognizing and responding to signs of trafficking that had previously been misidentified as family dysfunction or behavioral problems, training social workers to detect patterns of abuse that suggested organized exploitation rather than isolated incidents of neglect or violence. Rocky's legacy extended beyond his individual heroism to inspire a new generation of canine trainers who understood that police dogs could serve as bridges between law enforcement and communities that had learned to distrust traditional authority figures, building relationships that made cooperation possible in investigations that required community support to succeed. As the years passed and Emily grew from a traumatized 6-year-old into a confident teenager, Rocky aged beside her with the grace of a guardian whose mission had been fulfilled but whose protective instincts remained as sharp as ever, proving that heroism doesn't diminish with time but evolves into something deeper and more enduring than momentary acts of courage. Their daily routines at Officer Barnes's farmhouse created a new normal that honored the past, while embracing a future that neither of them could have imagined during those dark months when survival was measured in heartbeats and hope was sustained by the presence of a German shepherd who refused to abandon those who needed him most. The ripple effects of Rocky's actions continued to transform lives across the country as other survivors of similar operations found the courage to come forward, inspired by Emily's example and empowered by legal precedents that recognized trafficking victims as heroes rather than damaged goods who should be hidden from public view. The International Center for Missing and Exploited Children established the Rocky Protocol, a systematic approach to investigating cases where traditional methods had failed, recognizing that sometimes the most important evidence came from sources that conventional law enforcement might overlook in their focus on human testimony and technological solutions. Emily's decision to pursue a career in veterinary medicine surprised no one who knew her story, but her specific interest in training therapy dogs for trauma survivors represented a natural evolution of the bond that had saved her life and continued to provide the foundation for everything she hoped to achieve in her own efforts to help others heal from experiences that challenged the limits of human resilience. The annual memorial service for Officer Tom Daniels became a gathering point for families affected by trafficking, a reminder that individual acts of heroism could inspire collective action that protected future generations from predators who thrived in environments where victims had no voice and perpetrators operated with impunity. Rocky's presence at these ceremonies, now moving slowly but still alert to the emotional needs of those around him, served as a living symbol of the principle that duty transcends formal assignments, and true service continues long after official recognition ends and public attention moves to other stories. The questions that Emily posed during interviews in her later years reflected a wisdom earned through suffering, but tempered by the love of those who had refused to let darkness define her future. How many other children might still be waiting for rescue in places that exist beyond the reach of traditional investigation methods? How many potential heroes walk among us unrecognized, carrying the capacity for extraordinary courage, but lacking the circumstances that would call forth their greatest gifts? The establishment of the Rocky Foundation, dedicated to training rescue dogs for specialized operations involving missing children, ensured that his legacy would continue long after his own remarkable life ended, creating a network of four-legged heroes who understood that some missions require patience, measured in months rather than minutes, and success, defined by lives saved rather than cases closed. As Rocky entered his final years, his bond with Emily remained as strong as ever. Two survivors who had pulled each other through hell and emerged with a shared understanding that healing happens not through forgetting the past, but through transforming trauma into purpose that serves something greater than individual survival. The mystery that haunts those who know their story isn't how a supposedly dead police dog managed to navigate storms and hospital corridors to save one child's life, but how many other Rockies might be out there right now, following scents and instincts that could lead us to victims we don't even know exist. If only we had the wisdom to listen to voices that speak without words and trust in heroes who ask for nothing except the chance to serve those who cannot save themselves. And you, what did you think about this story? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.